Hello everyone, this is your instructor Kwame Shen. This lecture is the first of a two-part lecture on the chemistry of life. Microorganisms use resources such as food components to actually build new molecules, and they also need energy, which they get from the breaking down of molecules within them in order to actually build these new molecules that we generally call macromolecules. So for the objectives of this lecture in its entirety, that will appreciate what elements are, what chemical bonds are, the different types of chemical bonds that exist, and the basic understanding of chemical reactions and the different types of chemical reactions that we have. And then the last part would also look at biological molecules, which we call macromolecules. We'll look at the inorganic and organic molecules that exist in living organisms. Their functional groups, the importance of that, monomers and polymers. We'll look at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids as well. Everything that exists is made up of atoms. So everything is made up, all matter is made up of atoms. The atoms are the smallest unit of all matter. And if you go beyond the atom, if atoms are broken down, then you lose the property that atom had. So let's say you take an atom of oxygen. If you should break it down beyond the atomic level, it will lose the property that makes it oxygen. Atoms have basically two parts. You have the nucleus, that's the center, it's the most dense part of the atom, and it is made up of protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged atoms, neutrons are neutral charged atoms or uncharged atomic particles. So as you see in this picture, you would have the protons and the neutrons here at the center of the atom. Another important component of the atom are electrons, and these electrons are negatively charged, and they move in what we describe a space that is described as electron shells. So you will have the electrons moving around the atom and the neutrons that are at the center, but they move in these shells. They are negatively charged. Atoms have the same number of protons and neutrons. And so if you take an atom like magnesium, which has an atomic number of 12, we'll talk about atomic number in a moment, but it has 12 electrons and 12 protons. So essentially, these charges will cancel out, and so the charge on an atom is zero. An atom is electrically neutral. It has no charge. If you have the same kind of atoms coming together, you get an element. So oxygen, again, we're made up of several atoms of oxygen coming together for us to give us the element oxygen. We have discovered, and always new ones are being discovered every now and then, several elements that are naturally occurring and some that has been synthesized in the laboratory. Conservatively, there are 92 naturally occurring elements. I say conservatively because the number changes every now and then. You may have ranges between 92 and 98 as naturally occurring, but most of them are actually elements that are found in very small quantities, and they are very transient. They don't last forever. These elements are arranged in a table known as a periodic table. The periodic table is arranged based on the number of atoms, the number of protons, sorry, which is the atomic number, the number of electrons and how they are arranged, and the recurring nature of certain properties. So if you look at the periodic table, you have, they are grouped based on the number of shells. So for those that have just one shell, those that have two shells will be found here, those that have three shells. The shell is the region around the nucleus where you have the electrons moving. And then you have, based on the number of atoms in the number of electrons, sorry, in the outermost shell, they are also arranged in groups. So you have groups and periods. Groups and periods. Arrangement in terms of the numbering is based on the atomic number, which is the number of protons. So hydrogen has atomic number of 1, so it's the first element. Helium has atomic number of 2, it's the second, and you go on and on and on like that. To read the periodic table, you need to know which is the atomic number. Typically, it's the element is written this way. So you have a letter symbol representing the element. So in this case, you have C representing carbon. And these are all internationally accepted abbreviations for these elements. And you would have 6 for carbon on top of it. And that 6 represents the number of protons. Essentially, it will have the same number of electrons as well. And it will also have what we call the mass number, or atomic mass. And the atomic mass is the number of protons and neutrons. So carbon has an atomic number of 6, has a atomic mass or mass number of 12. It has 6 electrons as well. So 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons. Okay. Atoms may also exist as isotopes. So you have atoms that have the same number of protons and neutrons, and those are the most common ones. However, there are instances where you would have atoms with the same number of protons but different number of neutrons. So for instance, we have carbon 12, carbon 13, carbon 14, which is actually very, very common and something that we use in carbon dating to tell the Earth, the age of the Earth and the age of organic molecules that we find buried in the Earth in terms of fossil records and the likes. So these are our protons, the blue ones. The reddish ones are the neutrons. So for carbon 12, it has the same number of protons and neutrons. Carbon 13 will have the same in terms of 6 protons. So it has 6 protons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it has 7 neutrons. So the atomic number is the same, but the atomic mass or the mass number is different. It becomes 13. And the same for carbon 14, where it has 8 neutrons and 6 protons. So isotopes are atoms with different number of neutrons in their nuclei, and they are radioactive in nature, in that they decay over time because they are generally unstable. And so that's how we come by radioactive dating. they decay in a manner that you can actually calculate and tell how long they've been there, how long ago fresh components of those atoms were introduced into that system. Electrons are arranged around the nucleus in a manner that ensures or that seeks stability. So atoms are generally trying to be more stable. That's the whole idea. The more stable they are, the better it is for them. So you would have the innermost shell, and the innermost shell can take a maximum of 2 electrons. The second and the third shells can hold a maximum of 8 electrons each. So if you take helium, for instance, it will only have 1 shell because it only has 2 electrons. Okay. And neon has 2 in the innermost shell, and it has 8 in the outermost shell. So it makes it very stable. So these are all very stable atoms, elements. We can look at this electronic configuration in terms of how the electrons are arranged for all the elements that exist. And so if we look at hydrogen first period, it has only 1 shell. The second period, period 2 has 2 shells. Period 3 has 3 shells. And it's all based on the number of electrons. And all atoms here will try to attain this goal where they have a maximum of 2 in the innermost, maximum of 8 in the first outer shell and the second outer shell as it applies, because that is when you are more stable. These gases that have achieved the full electron, the maximum of electrons in the outermost shell, are known as the noble gases. So hydrogen, helium, neon, argon, these are all known as the noble gases. Many other elements will share electrons or actually transfer electrons totally in order to gain this goal, to get this goal of filling their outermost shell and being stable. The number of empty spaces in the outermost shell, or the number of electrons available in the outermost shell, determines the level, the extent to which the element can combine with other elements. And that is what we call the valence. So the valence of an atom is the number of electrons in the outermost shell. Okay. And it's more, it works more when we're talking about the main group elements. It might not work for that perfectly for other groups of elements in the periodic table. So if you take magnesium has an atomic number of 12. And so the first shell will take 2. That's the maximum it can take. The second shell will take 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the third shell will take 2. So the number of electrons in the outermost shell in this case is just 2. So the valence is 2. If we take oxygen has an atomic number of 8. So first shell will take 2, second shell will take 6. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the valence is 6. Most biological molecules that we find in living organisms are made up predominantly of these 6 elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The acronym is CHNOPS. That way you can remember all of it. So you can do the electron configuration. You can actually list, if you have the atomic number is represented by Z. So you have the element, you have the atomic number, You have the first shell that will take 2, the second shell that will take a maximum of 8, third shell maximum of 8, fourth maximum of 8, like that. You can actually then do a configuration. Just write that, for instance, if you have carbon, we know that carbon is going to have a configuration of 2, 4. 2 being the first shell is going to take 2, the second shell is going to take 4 out of the 8 maximum that it needs. So how is this even related to living organisms? What's the whole goal of this? The elements, to understand them better, help us to appreciate what's happening within living organisms. These elements will form bonds either with themselves or with different elements. So you have atoms of oxygen that may form bonds with other atoms of oxygen, and that will result in what we call molecules. So let's say a scoop of an ice cream is an atom. If you have 2 scoops of the same kind, that's a molecule. And so you have oxygen atom, that's oxygen molecule. If you have 2 or more of different scoops, then you are forming a compound. So within our bodies, we have molecules and compounds. And it's because these atoms are able to form chemical bonds. Chemical bonds enable these atoms to interact. That's why we have reactions taking place, and these reactions will produce energy. These reactions would end up in products, the production of end products, such as enzymes, which our bodies might need, or the bodies of these microorganisms might need to metabolize their food. So there are 3 different types of bonds. We have ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. Atoms will try to form bonds that makes them the most stable. So they are seeking stability. So the ones that, based on the energy that is needed, is more favorable to them, is the ones that atoms will generally pursue. So talking about ionic bonds, we need to understand what ions are. We already know that for a naturally occurring atom, for an atom in its natural state, would have equal number of protons and electrons, making it electrically neutral. So if you take an atom like chlorine, chlorine has 17 protons and 17 electrons. That makes it electrically neutral. And so the first shell of chlorine would take 2, the second would take 8, that makes it 10. The third can take a maximum of 8, but then to be left with only 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Meaning it needs 1 more. Okay. 1 more electron in order for it to complete the outermost shell, which the maximum is 8 electrons. So what chlorine atom will do in the presence of an extra electron, if chlorine should take this electron, what happens to the net charge is that there will be a net negative charge of 1, because in this case then you would have 17 protons, because there was no change in the protons, the number of positive ions, the number of positive charges. But however, you have an extra negative charge, so now there's 18 electrons or 18 negative charges, making the net charge on the newly formed ion -1. So when an atom gains or loses electron, it becomes an ion. It carries a charge. If an atom loses an electron, it becomes a positively charged ion. If it gains an electron, it becomes a negatively charged ion. And that's would help the atoms to form ionic bonds. So atoms may form ionic bonds. That is, you have sodium, which has an atomic number of 11. So the first shell will take 2, the second will take 8. The last one has 1, only 1 electron. It will be easier for sodium to lose this electron than to gain 7 more to make its outermost shell full. So during chemical bond formations, what sodium typically does is that is going to release this electron to another atom that actually needs just one electron. So in this case, chlorine needs one to complete the outermost shell. And so this is an example of an ionic bond. You have a positively charged atom, ion, a negatively charged ion, and those two charges electrostatically coming together to form the bond between the two. And that is salt for us. Okay. Ionic bonds are formed because there's a complete transfer of the valence electrons, the outermost electron, from one atom to the other. Ionic bonds results typically in crystallized structures. So if you take salt, for instance, you put it in water, it dissolves easily. We'll see the property of water and you see how that easily happens. But it's very easy for these ions to break down in a medium like water, so that you have the sodium and the electrons coming apart. Then we have covalent bonds. Covalent bonds is also a type of chemical bonds, but in this case there is a sharing of electrons. So instead of a direct transfer of electron from one atom to other, the atoms end up sharing electron pairs. So one atom will bring an electron or more, and that will bring an electron or more, and then they will share together. But in the process, they all achieve the stable status that they seek in terms of filling the outermost shell. Covalent bonds are actually more common in living organisms and in nature than other bonds, and it's actually the strongest of all the bonds. They don't dissociate so easily in solution. So if you look at the two, you have covalent bonds, there is a sharing of electron. In ionic bonds, there is a transfer of one electron from an atom to another atom. For covalent bonds, you could have different types of them based on the number of electrons that are being shared. So you could have a single bond when 2 electrons are shared, double bond when 4, and triple bonds. And the more electrons are shared, the more energy will be needed to break them apart. So if you take water molecule, you have these are single bonds, just 2 electrons are shared, 2 electrons are shared. So this is a single bond, that's a single bond. In ammonia, you have a similar thing, you have single bond, well, you have 3 of them. Methane, you have 4 single bonds. So 2 electrons are shared, 2 electrons are shared, 2 electrons. So in the end, you have 4 bonds that are formed, single bonds. You could also have double bonds. So that is when you have more than 2 electrons that are shared. So you have more than 2 electrons shared between 2 atoms. Note that in this case, you have one atom and another atom sharing only 2 electrons, or one pair of electrons. In terms of the double and triple bonds, you have 2 atoms that are sharing more than 1 pair. So when you have 2 pairs that are shared, you end up with a double covalent bond. And that's the case in oxygen gas. In nitrogen gas, you have a triple covalent bond. And that would also mean there is more energy and that you need more energy involved in breaking them apart. One thing that you need to note, however, is that although I am describing ionic and covalent bonds separately, the bonds that are formed in molecules do not belong entirely in one group or the other. The bonds range from highly ionic to highly covalent. So it's always a mixture that exists actually in nature. Then we have hydrogen bonds. And hydrogen bonds are another kind of bond that are formed between molecules. So if we look at the bond between oxygen and hydrogen, if you look at the periodic table again, I'll take you back to slide 9, you will notice something. So there is generally a trend as you go across a period, the ability of an atom to draw an electron from another atom increases, which we describe that process or that characteristic as electronegativity. It becomes more electronegative, so that oxygen can draw an electron towards itself more than nitrogen, but fluorine can draw an electron towards itself more than oxygen. So as you go across the period, electronegativity increases. Okay. Now, using that knowledge, what you would notice is that oxygen is at the far end of the periodic table, far right end. Hydrogen is on the far left end. And so oxygen is more electronegative, has more power to attract an electron onto itself than hydrogen. So in any bond formation between oxygen and hydrogen, the electron that they're sharing will be more drawn towards the oxygen than the hydrogen. What this results in is that oxygen attains a slightly or partial negative charge, and hydrogen or becomes partially positive. And so they become polarized. This property that results from the bond formation then makes it easier for hydrogen to get attached to another compound that has a negative charge as part of its constitution, and for oxygen to be also drawn to another compound that has a positive charge as part of its constitution. So if you take water, you would have other molecules of water that also, you have hydrogen slightly positive here, you have oxygen slightly negative, and so a bond is formed between the two. Another bond can be formed between the hydrogen and oxygen over here, on and on. And these are known as hydrogen bonds. They are very weak, and they are not true covalent or ionic bonds. So the difference between hydrogen bond and covalent and ionic bonds is that hydrogen bonds are intermolecular bonds. So they are formed between molecules. This is a molecule because you have an atom forming bonds with other atoms, and then they in turn join in to form a bond between those two molecules. So it's one water molecule, another water molecule. So this is the hydrogen bond. The bond that is formed between the hydrogen and oxygen over here, however, is a covalent bond. So hydrogen bond is an intermolecular bond. They are weaker bonds. Covalent and ionic bonds are intramolecular bonds. Chemical reactions would then occur. So if you have these atoms existing in the same system, based on the energy available or the energy needed, chemical reactions will proceed. They will interact with each other. They will form bonds or they will break bonds. So when bonds are formed or broken, you have chemical reactions taking place. And this may result in the use of energy, and such reactions are described as endergonic reactions, where energy is absorbed and used. And then you have other chemical reactions where energy is released, and those are exergonic reactions. These substances, in terms of what substances come together to react, are known as reactants. So the substances that go into the chemical reaction are the reactants. The products or the end results, what we get at the end of the reaction, are described as the product. So if you have sodium and ion and chloride ion coming together, and these are the reactants in the chemical reaction, and the product will be sodium chloride, which is salt. We can group chemical reactions based on how they proceed and the end product and how the end product is formed into three groups. We have the synthetic. So for the synthetic reactions, chemical reactions, there is a synthesis. So new products are produced. So for instance, you have A and B being the reactants, and the product being AB. So this is a new molecule that has been formed, and it's a synthesis reaction. Then you have decomposition. Decomposition is when you have bonds that are broken between molecules, and when those bonds are broken, it's an example of decomposition reaction. And then we have exchange reactions. For exchange reactions, you have both synthesis and decomposition happening. So for instance, A and B plus C, there is a breakup decomposition of A and B, but then there is a synthesis of A and C, and you have a similar exchange reaction taking place here. These are examples of it. So if you have hydrogen peroxide, and hydrogen peroxide undergoes a chemical reaction and it's broken down, we have water and oxygen. So this is an example of a decomposition reaction. And then you have manganese, magnesium, and nitrogen gas coming together to form magnesium nitrate, and this example of a synthesis. And then you have sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid coming together to form sodium chloride and water, and this is an example of both synthesis and decomposition. That's an exchange reaction. Synthesis are generally important in what we call anabolic process, the building of molecules. We need synthesis to build molecules, so anabolism. And these processes will need energy. So synthesis requires energy to form the new bonds. Remember, new bonds are made in synthesis reaction. The decomposition reaction results in the breakage of bonds, and that's what we call catabolism, the breaking down of bonds. And energy is released during these processes. Reactions theoretically could happen in both directions. So all reactions in theory could happen both in the forward direction and the reverse direction, meaning when the reactants come together to form a product, the product could also undergo a reaction and form the reactant again, in theory. However, in practice, we see some reactions happening more readily in the forward direction, in just one direction, than others. We have a set of reactions that are able to occur in both forward and reverse reaction. And those reactions that we see practically happening, both in forward and reverse reactions, are known as reversible reactions. So you have a compound like this, when it's broken down and the water and the copper sulfates are released, they could recombine again once they are formed. As more and more products are formed, they start recombining again, and then you have the reactants being formed again. So that's an example of a reversible reaction. So this overview of the chemical composition of life is the first part of the lecture on the chemistry of life.